and welcome to another booktube video from me, Lauren, from Lauren and the Books. I hope you're all having a lovely Wednesday. July it is now, imagine. Today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in the month of June. There's 11 books. June was primarily supposed to be Pride and Prejudice, where I read Pride and Prejudice and retellings of Pride and Prejudice. I did do that. I read Pride and Prejudice and then I read 5 retellings of Pride and Prejudice. All various levels of enjoyment throughout, from a 1-star to a 5-star, so I'm looking forward to talking about those. And then I've got some other books to talk about that I read in the month as well. So I'll start with, so this isn't going to be wrapping up in the order that I read them. It's going to be wrapping up in Pride and Prejudice and then other books. So we'll start with Pride and Prejudice. You're closing the door on me, David. Can't you bear the sound of my voice? Goodbye. I started with Pride and Prejudice. I started the month with Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I mean, I don't really need to go into much detail here in plot. I gave it 5 stars. I really loved it. What I really loved about this particular experience of it, firstly, is this amazing, like, I cannot recommend this book as a gift more. It's so lovely. Every time I read it, I get more and more joy out of it. This is the sort of illustrations that are in it. The colour palette in it is beautiful. I'm not saying anything I haven't said about this book before because it's just so lovely. Double pages. I mean, there's really lovely, like, really gorgeous bits in there. What I really enjoyed about this experience of reading was also the fact that I watched along with the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth and Jennifer Eel, I think her name is. It's on Netflix at the moment, so I would literally read up to the point where, like, I would watch an episode of it, then read up to that point, or the other way round, or like stop, and I just had such a lovely time just like reading along with it. So I was very immersed in this whole thing. That's 6 hours worth of Pride and Prejudice as well, because, well, just under 6 hours. They're all like 52 minutes long and stuff like that. So yeah, I read that and watched it at the same time. It was a delight. So 5 stars for that. But let's move on to the adaptations. And just coincidentally, they're in the order of which I'd given them the shittest to the best stars. So let's review them in that order. 1 star, Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld. I cannot believe how awful this was. So and more so, I can't believe I got to the end of this. Like, I gave this 1 star. The Bennets in themselves, all of them, or not even just the Bennets, just everyone in this book is horrible. Like, really privileged, just gets loads of lucky breaks that they don't deserve. Everyone's dripping in like first world problems. It's unbelievable. Add into that, as if I could not enjoy it very much anyway, add into that Wickham. So the Wickham character in this book is split into 2 separate characters. So there's Jasper Wick, who acts as Liz's love interest, who you later find out did a racist attack. He actually pissed on the computer of one of the teachers at the school that he was at. Like, unbelievable. And then it's also, so that's one side of Wickham, and then there's another character whose name is Ham, who ends up marrying Lydia, who's a really nice guy and also happens to be trans. And the big drama around it is that he's trans, and Mrs. Bennet can't get her head around it, and oh my god. And there's like this moment where Darcy heroically sort of tells Mrs. Wickham that, oh, don't worry, it's a birth defect, and sort of like really just like dumbs everything down for her. And she sort of then, oh, it's just ugh. I just felt like this when I was reading it. Really disappointed. Like, it's supposed to be like this, like, up-to-date Pride and Prejudice in the 21st century. Shit, it was. So that was 1 star. The next one I gave 2 stars. This was Unmarriageable by Sanaya Kamal, and there were points of this that I did enjoy. So for instance, it's reimagined, the family are reimagined as the Benats, and we follow Alice Benat, who is an English teacher at a school. Now she really loves Pride and Prejudice, although I've got a problem with that a bit later on. She loves Pride and Prejudice, and one of my favourite chapters was the opening chapter where she talks to her students about reimaginings of the opening to Pride and Prejudice, that famous first line, and it's a really good insight into like women in Pakistan and their views on marriage and things like that, and young girls in Pakistan. And I was like, oh, this has got such promise. This is really great. I'm going to really enjoy that. Then the thing that every time I read it I got dragged out of it was the constant fat shaming, and it's constant. Kitty's character in here is described as fat, disgusting, like any sort of all the tropey sort of shitty words that normally get described with, like, when they're like fat shaming people. That's all in there. Anyone who speaks, if food's involved, they're worried about eating that because it might make them fat. Oh, I've eaten this and I'm worried it's going to make me fat. Oh, I really want to eat that, but it was going to make me fat. Like, just constant. And also, another thing I did like about this is that Alice talks constantly about how much she loves Pride and Prejudice, references it throughout the book, talks to her students about Pride and Prejudice, but never once does she think, oh, isn't it weird that the bloke that I'm in love with is called Darcy, the bloke that I fancy is called Darcy, and and my best friend's called Sherry Lucullus, and like, she just doesn't, and it just really pulled me out of it. I was like, if you were that into Pride and Prejudice, you'd think, oh, this is all a bit similar, isn't it? But there was none of that. There's plenty of like referencing Pride and Prejudice, but none of like, oh, this is weird because this is just like what it happened in Pride and Prejudice. So I gave that 2 stars because there were elements of it I really liked, but sadly the fat shaming for me was just ugh. And then yeah, I kept sort of being pulled out of it because of her love for Pride and Prejudice and how much she just didn't see that in her story. I got an audiobook proof, which I've never had before, of the book Charlotte by Helen Moffat, which is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice and beyond, from the perspective of Charlotte Lucas, who becomes Charlotte Collins. And actually I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed seeing a more sort of developed Charlotte. I enjoyed seeing a sort of like and not so much, I wouldn't use the word sassy, but definitely fruitier, I think is the word I use in my Instagram review. There's shagging in it, there's like flirting in it, and there's sort of like, she goes on to explain some of her actions. Now obviously there's a lot of creative license with this, but it all sort of ran quite true for me. Mrs. Bennet in this particular, so in all of these retellings that I read over the month, Mrs. Bennet is the complete villain bitch, like absolutely, and in this book in particular, a lot of, like, it's alluded to that Charlotte only married Mr. Collins just to fuck over Mrs. Bennet, basically. Yeah, so this goes on beyond Pride and Prejudice, and it does introduce new characters, which it didn't really do in either of those books. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was really really well done, and like I said, nothing seemed out of the ordinary for me. It wasn't like anything was sort of stretched. Then the next one I've got, which I also gave 3 stars, is Pride by Ibby Zaboy. This is a YA retelling which is set in New York. There's a lot in here to do with gentrification and not recognising the place that you've grown up and the place that you've loved, and I thought it was very well done for a YA book. Probably the loosest based retelling of Pride and Prejudice. There was a lot of things in there that didn't sort of ring true with the book. For example, Darcy and Bingley being brothers, that's just one that's come into my mind, and sort of like they'd omitted some of the characters in here, and yeah, just like not, it didn't ring entirely true, but as a standalone like YA book, I think it's really good, great. And the gentrification stuff in particular, the sort of the love story between Darcy and Zuri, I've got a name for a minute then, Zuri in this, so Zuri's the Elizabeth Bennet character, runs sort of secondary to the real love story, which is Zuri's love for her hood, which I really thought was lovely. There's a lot of spoken word in here and things like that, but yeah, not my favourite, but thought it was good, and as a YA book I thought it was really great. It's getting really dark in here, and I think I'm gonna have to put that other light on. Then the last retelling of the month was my favourite retelling of the month, and I actually gave it 5 stars. I really loved it, and it was the book that we were reading for Patreon Book Club, so it was really great to read it and then to go on and discuss it afterwards, and that was Longbourn by Jo Baker. This is a retelling and beyond and before of Pride and Prejudice from the servants' point of views. Now, I love Downton Abbey. I only watched the Downton Abbey film last night again, and I sort of had high hopes for this, and I was hoping that it would sort of be Downton Abbey-esque, and it really was. It really delivered what I wanted it to do. It was the Pride and Prejudice story, but honestly, the original story completely, I was really involved in that, and I'd get the odd sort of like nibble of, oh yeah, I've just remembered that, like, it would just sort of like drop in that Jane's been fucked over by this bloke that she's really fancied, and it would bring you back to like, oh, so this is about Pride and Prejudice. What I really liked about it, it didn't sort of sugarcoat in the way that maybe Downton Abbey does. It didn't sugarcoat any of the the servants' jobs, and there's a lot in there about like how awful so you're following Sarah as the main character, how awful her chilblains are on her hands and how shitty she feels, and she's having to do this horrible job, and there's period blood and there's shit and pus, and like there's no, it feels really real, which I really like that. And as I said, the original story holds its own. I really like the original story, and I said you're following Sarah, but you're also following Hill and another chap called James who turns up and becomes a footman, and a young girl, Polly. There's people excited outside probably about this book, and I just really loved it. Everything about it I really enjoyed, and it just felt really cozy and wonderful, and I feel like this is going to be one that I'm going to go back and revisit, just because I had such a lovely time reading it. So really enjoyed that one. 5 stars, one of my favourite books of the month. So those are the Pride and Prejudice books. I'll start with and then I've got 5 more books, and I'll go through the audiobooks of the books that I read this month that weren't to do with Pride and Prejudice. The first one was a reread. It was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Edo-Lodge. As I said, this was a reread. Black Lives Matter has been at the forefront of my mind throughout June, and I wanted to remind myself of that amazing book, and I got even more from it the second time round. I gave it 5 stars. It's absolutely fantastic. It's so uncomfortable to read, it's so interesting and insightful to read, and it's just so educational in a way that really hammers it home, and like I said, like you feel uncomfortable reading it as a white person, and it's just so, yeah, it's just so educational and so important. I remember putting on my Instagram reviews, if you read one book this year, let it be this, because it's just so important and encapsulates a lot of what's going on with race, particularly in the UK. And I feel like it's one of the only books on race that focuses on the UK. A lot of the books, and some books that I've read this month in fact, focus on race in the US, so as someone who lives in the UK, I found it very valuable to read, and particularly pertinent to the situation that's going on. So that was one of the audiobooks I read. I also listened to Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. I got this on Audible. I thought this was brilliant. I gave this 5 stars as well. What I really thought was amazing about this was how much it brought up how things that I didn't even think were a feminist issue are. Things like hunger, things like gun crime, things like housing, and it really opened my eyes to sort of how what previously I'd sort of associated with feminism is a sort of like white privilege, the sort of girl power feminism that I loved and hold so dear isn't particularly inclusive to other people. And again, that's an uncomfortable thing to realise, and again, it's something I'm definitely going to work on, because intersectional, like feminism isn't feminism unless it involves everyone. So yeah, it really was eye-opening, and it dwells on some real personal experiences of Mickey's, which I think makes it even more like effective for me. I thought it was great, and I really would recommend it. The last audiobook I'm going to talk about is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. Big smile on my face. I gave this book 5 stars. Imagine the delight when you read Girl, Woman, Other and you think it's an amazing book and you give it 5 stars, and then you read Mr. Loverman, another book of hers, and you realise that that's just as fucking good as Girl, Woman, Other as well. I loved Mr. Loverman. I loved the character. Let me tell you what it's about before I start going into it. In Mr. Loverman, you are following an older gentleman called Barrington. He goes by the name of Barry, and you're following his life and his sort of tumultuous marriage with his wife Carmel, and you're also following his love story really with Morris, a bloke that he's been in love with and in a romantic and sexual relationship since they were boys. It's set mainly in London, when Barry is an older guy, which is another thing I really liked about it. It's like a generation of people that you don't really hear love stories from, which I really loved, but also set partly in Antigua, where he met Morris, and where he met Carmel. And yeah, you follow him and his love story and his sort of like his wife's story and their kids. And the guy who narrated it did a really great job of sort of like bringing across these his 2 daughters who are quite different. One he gets on very well with, and one his wife Carmel gets on. You also like, you hear from Carmel's perspective, but the book is about Barrington and about his life, but you hear from him and Carmel's point of view, and I just loved it. It's just so, you really get to know these guys, you really get to know these characters, which is also what I loved about Girl, Woman, Other, is that how in depth everything goes with with people's characters. But yeah, I just loved it. I've got such a thrill when I think about Bernardine Evaristo's books. I'm really looking forward to read it. Well, I'm going to get on audio. They're out, I think they're out on the 14th of July. The Emperor's Babe and Blonde Roots. And then there's another one called The Tourist something. And yeah, I can't wait to read more of her stuff, because like 2 books, both 5 stars, and yeah, this is the smiley face, and it was just a sort of really nice, like nicely wrapped up happy ending book as well. Not that that spoils the ending, but yeah, it's got a really happy ending, and I loved it. So the last 2 books I've got to talk about that I read this month, the first one is Don't Touch My Hair by Emma Dabiri. This is a non-fiction book. Emma Dabiri is a Irish Nigerian author, and this is a history of slavery, colonialisation, black history, all told through hair, which was just such an original idea. It's so amazing. It's written so perfectly, and what I also loved about this as well as being like so interesting and so educational in a way where I was literally like yum 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 yum, can't wait to learn more about that. I also really loved her turn of phrase. Now, she's Irish and I love an Irish turn of phrase, but yeah, there's just some really funny sort of like sass lines in here, which I just absolutely loved. So interesting, so much stuff in there that I hadn't even considered. And like I said, just educational, perfect. I'm about to lend this to my best friend Emma because I think she's gonna love it. But yeah, really, really thought this was great. Gave that 4 stars. And then the last book of the month, which is actually the last book I've read of the month, so we've got around the houses, we've got back to the last book I've read of the month, was Noughts Crosses by Mallory Blackman. I read this for my online book club and also my book club in real life, which is currently an online book club because of coronavirus. This was a reread of Noughts Crosses for me. Every time I read it, I cannot believe the ending, and every time I read it, I read the ending with such tears in my eyes and such my heart in my throat. This is a book about Seffi and Callum, who are noughts and crosses. So Seffi is black, and in the class structure is thriving, and Callum is white and is in the class structure not thriving so much. They have a relationship whereby they played together as children when Callum's mother worked for Seffi's mother, and then as they get older they realise their differences, etc, etc. Now, I really think this is an amazing book, and I can't wait to read more of the series. I feel like I've only ever read the second in the series, and there's 5 books in the series now. I gave it 4 stars, and the reason it didn't get a 5-star, because I do think this is such a powerful, amazing book with so much stuff in there that like is just perfectly done. And considering this was written in 2001, it holds up. It's an amazing book to read now. It feels like it was written yesterday. I think it's fantastic. But I feel like some of the interactions between the characters don't read as young people or don't read as teenagers, and that's why I couldn't quite give it the 5 stars. That I feel like the plot and everything else covers it amazingly, but sometimes I was like, oh, that doesn't sound like 2 teenagers speaking to each other, or that didn't sound like 2 young people speaking to each other, and that's why I didn't give it 5 stars. But thought it was amazing, gave it 4 stars. It's a reread for me. I think it's really great, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the series. So those are the books that I read in the month of June. God, this video's been a long old wrap up, hasn't it? Let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know what you read in June, and I will speak to you again soon for another book video.